Today, we have great response to the registration. A lot of people here today, and then a lot of people getting the recording afterwards. So at the beginning of the year, September, what I think about a lot of times is screening students for risk, or how do we identify the students who could potentially be struggling. And obviously, a lot of you all are thinking about that as well because you're here today. But I just want to share a little bit of context. So typically when we think of screening assessments, we're thinking of this in the context of RTI. And so in RTI, you have tier one, tier two, and tier three. Tier one is typically thought of as that um, universal tier of instruction for all students, right? It's typically what we thought of as school growing up. It's the whole class, grade level, typical instruction. Screening assessments are administered to everyone in that tier, and we call them a screening assessment. If you picture a screen, like a window screen, a screen allows certain things to pass through, like air and the breeze and all that stuff, and it keeps certain things out. And so that's really the purpose of a screening assessment. It really exists as the screen between tier one and tier two to keep certain students out of tier two who don't need it. So if you are going to be successful in tier one instruction and you don't need any additional supports, we want to keep you out of tier two and we want to let into tier two all those students who are going to be struggling or who have the risk for struggle this academic school year. So a couple features of academic screening. First is that these are universally administered. Typically in the past, if I were giving this presentation 15 years ago when I first was trained in universal screening, it was given one time a year at the beginning of the year, which is why we think about it around this time of the year. Everyone received universal screening, universal meaning for everyone. The whole school, the whole grade level, the whole class received, participated in the screening measure. Um, Now, more recently, typically it's common for screening measures to be administered up to three times a year at the beginning, middle, and end of the year. And that's, just sort of change in how we've done things over the years. When you take a screening assessment, there's a cut point that indicates risk status. So if you score above this cut point, we think that you are not at risk. If you score below a certain cut point, we think that you are at risk. And when we say at risk, we mean at risk of failing or at risk of struggling on some academic measure. So um, that cut point is supposed to be based in research and evidence, but it is somewhat arbitrary. And especially if you really get into some of the research around these cut points, there can be what we call confidence intervals around the cut point. And so we say that if you score, let's just use round numbers. If you score below a 20 on this assessment, that means that you are at risk. But really, with the confidence intervals, if you score anywhere between 25 and 15, we think that you're probably at risk also, just based on that interval of how confident we are in your risk status. And I'll give you an example in just a second to make that a little more tangible. We also want these measures to have evidence for validity for identifying struggling students. They should have some validity evidence. They should produce reliable data. In other words, students should get similar scores on this assessment when they take it repeatedly. Although they aren't going to take it repeatedly in your classroom, researchers should be able to demonstrate that they do produce reliable data when done repeatedly. And then finally, the last thing is classification accuracy. This is really important when it comes to screening assessments. Classification accuracy refers to, does the measure accurately classify students by risk status? When they say you are at risk or not at risk, is that an accurate classification that it's making for students? So I'll show you what this looks like practically. If we have two assessments for a child on the screen. On the left, y-axis, you see the outcome assessment. So think of this as your end of year state test um, that students need to pass their grade level. And then on the bottom, on the x-axis, we have a screening assessment. And so the screening assessment is your universal screener that's given to everyone, we'll say at the beginning of the year. Let's say, for the sake of illustration, that everyone who scores below a 25 on the screening assessment is at risk for risk. Sorry, at risk for failure. I'm going to keep saying the word risk too many times. So what that means is this vertical line right here is the cut point. So if you score below in this area over here, we say you are at risk. If you score in this area up here, that means you are not at risk. Okay, but you can see that in our imaginary scenario, if you score below a 20 on the outcome assessment, this line right here, um, these people below did fail the outcome assessment. The people above passed our end of year state test. So by using these two lines, we end up with four quadrants. We have true positives. These are people who the screening assessment said were positive for risk, and they did end up failing the outcome assessment. Then we have these people over here. These are true negatives. In other words, the screening assessment said they were negative for risk, they're not at risk, and they passed the outcome assessment. So they were truly not at risk. Then we have this population of students down here. These are called false negatives. In other words, the screening assessment said that they were negative for risk because they're above the screening threshold, but they failed the outcome assessment. So these are what we call falling through the cracks. They're students who were not picked up by the screening assessment. They did not receive any tier two support. They did not receive any additional supports because of the screening assessment, but they ended up failing the end of year test. And so these are students that we would like to be able to identify more of because we don't like students falling through the cracks. These students over here are a little bit of a different problem. So these students are called false positives. They scored below our screening threshold, this vertical line. So they're positive for risk. But when they take the outcome assessment, they passed. They scored above our horizontal line. And so these students, this sounds bad to put it this way, but they can be thought of as a drain on resources. They took up seats in special ed classrooms or in tier two classrooms. They took up interventionist time. They used curriculum. They received all kinds of supports that they didn't actually need because it was a false positive in their results. Um, and so really these false negative kids should have been in the seats that the false positive children were in. And we have four different statistics. I'm not going to get into statistics today, but four different statistics for quantifying how accurate a screening measure is. And so I won't get into it today, but if we do an advanced screening measures lunch and learn session, we could get into some of those issues. And and in the resources section, I have an article that goes into explaining some of those things. Here's what a look at this and just what it looks like with some actual data. These students up here are the true negatives. They passed both the screening assessment and the state writing test. These students down here are the true positives. The screening assessment said they were positive for risk, and they did fail the state test. These students here are the false positives, the ones who received support that they did not need. These students down here are the false negatives. These are students who did not receive any additional support when they actually needed it. So when you look at that screen, that illustration I just gave, we really want to limit those false positives and false negatives. And so one way to do that is to use multiple screening tools. So a screening tool we've typically in the past thought of as one assessment, we give it at the beginning of the year. Nowadays, we give that screening assessment multiple times per year, typically up to 3 times per year. And now we can add multiple screening tools. So maybe you use a curriculum-based measurement tool and a district developed writing assessment tool or rubric. You use the test of written language and a teacher rating, holistic rating of the student's writing or something like that, but multiple screening tools. We could do the same thing in reading, where you have, one screening measure could be oral reading fluency, and another screening measure could be maze comprehension or something like that. So it's combining multiple screening tools, and there's different ways that you can handle multiple screening tools. One way is if you fail either screener, you're identified as at risk. So if you fail oral reading fluency or the maze screener, either one, you're identified as at risk and you receive tier 2 supports. Another option is where you have to fail both screeners before you get supports. So this is where if you're concerned about a measure having a lot of false positives, adding another screener that they have to fail can limit some of those false positives and require that they fail 2 screeners before getting tier 2 supports. You can combine the scores on 2 measures and come up with one cut point based on the combined total score. And that would be the third way. And then the fourth way would be sort of a gated screening measure. And what this really does is has it ranks in hierarchy these screening measures. So if you fail the first one, then you take the second one and get to evaluate the results on that one. But it's sort of a first assessment and then a second assessment process. Whereas these other ones, you take both of them regardless of how you score, and we evaluate your scores following one of those procedures. So in the context of RTI, it's really important when we talk about screening assessments that this is in a tiered system of support, and screening students for risk is not just so that we can, be really accurate at who's going to fail at the end of the year. The whole point is that we are going to provide then tier 2 level supports. In tier 2 level supports, we're not talking about progress monitoring today, but the next step in the assessment process would be tier 2 students, not all tier students in tier 1, but tier 2 students receiving additional progress monitoring. And if the progress monitoring data reveal that they are on track for their end of year goal, that's great. They continue receiving tier 2 services. But for the students who are not on track to receive to achieve their end of year goal, they would progress into tier 3 services potentially. The reason I mention this here is because it's not enough to just screen students for risk and know who those students are. It's not enough for a teacher just to have a list of the at-risk students in her class, or to have, color codes associated with each students based on their risk level. We really need to have structured supports. So what program, what curriculum, what intervention do they have access to in tier 2 because of their risk status? You've probably seen these percentages associated with RTI tiered interventions of support. So typically we think of tier 1 as being sufficient for around 85% of students. So most students in the class, 85%, should make sufficient progress, should meet their grade level expectations, should pass their end of year tests based on tier 1 levels of support. We typically think of tier 2 as being sufficient for 10% of students. And so beyond the 85, an additional 10% will benefit from tier 2 and achieve their end of year goals based on tier 2 levels of support. We typically think of tier 3 as being reserved for the most intense 5% of students' needs. So 5% of students will need tier 3 supports. When you're looking at screening assessment data, you can sometimes have a problem where your screening assessment says that only 50% of students in tier one passed the screener. If you have 50% of students that failed the screener, that's not a special ed problem. It's not a tier two problem. What that data indicate is that tier one needs to be addressed. Tier one needs to be addressed in a way where it's successful for more students. Tier two and tier three just aren't set up to have 50% of students in a grade level or in a class receiving those additional supports. At that point, Tier three is no longer individualized support. Tier two is no longer small group support because the numbers are getting so large that we can't address students' needs in a small group in an individualized way, the way that we're supposed to in tier two and tier three. So if your screening data reveal a large percent of students are failing the screening assessment, that needs to be addressed through tier one interventions and supports at the whole class level, improving the explicitness of instruction, improving the comprehensiveness of what features of instruction or what elements of reading instruction are being addressed through that core curriculum. I'm going to provide some resources here on the screen. You guys can take a picture of it, take a screenshot of it. We will also share the PowerPoint with all registered attendees with the recording. So some of these links that you can click on in here will be accessible to you through the PowerPoint that we send out to you all. One thing that I want to mention is sometimes when we talk about screening assessments, we talk a lot about elementary grades, and we talk a lot about literacy, especially reading. So the dynamic indicators of, I missed out a word there. It's dynamic indicators of basic early literacy skills, or DIBBLES. You may have heard of DIBBLES. These are free tools that anyone can use. You can download them. And even if your school may have a universal screening system set up already. If they don't, you can do this on your own for free through the DIBBLES website, and that's there as well. We talk a lot about reading screening assessments, but there's also screening assessments available for older students, including middle school algebra. This middle school algebra project I think is really exciting. And these are high quality measures that have been developed with the validity, the reliability, the classification, accuracy evidence that should be required of all these measures. And so that's a great project for you to check out as well. And then finally, the one resource that I'll share with you is the National Center on Intensive Intervention. They have a academic screening chart. So when you click on tools on their website, they have this academic screening chart. And if you click on that, it brings you to a page like this, and you can filter based on reading or mathematics, and then pre-K, elementary, middle school, or high school grade levels. This is just I didn't use any filters for this. You can see the title of the assessment here, the area of assessment here, and the grade level in the next column. They have different usability features. So what's the scoring format? Is it manually scored by you as the teacher, or is it automatically scored by a computer? How long does it take to administer and score? Is it individual or group administered? And then different decision rules that are included. Um, and then the next thing I'll show you is the classification accuracy. So I talked about this. You don't have to get into all the statistics. They show you here whether it's partially convincing evidence or fully convincing evidence or unconvincing evidence or data unavailable. The one thing I'll say as someone who does a lot of research in classification accuracy, this is one of the things I do, you're going to have a very hard time finding any screening measure that has fully convincing evidence for classification accuracy. And this is uh, partially due to how the NCII defines acceptable classification accuracy. There just aren't a lot of measures that meet that threshold. And then finally, you can look at the reliability and validity here, and we do find better statistics supporting the reliability and validity for these measures. You can see fully circled in bubbles indicating convincing evidence. And this is just, we're just looking at the first four in alphabetical order. There's dozens of assessments on this tool that you go can check out. Anyway, I just want to share those resources with you, and I'll stop sharing my screen and we can take any questions that you all have in the chat.
Thank you so much, John. Yes, please post any questions that you have in the chat or in the Q&A. So I love how you talked about how, when you have a large number of students in that don't pass the screener, and that is indicated that they need that extra intervention. Can you talk a little bit more about that the difference in the instruction and focusing on that tier one a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So in tier one, we want to make sure that um, our instruction is explicit for all students. And so if a lot of students in tier one are not uh, being successful in that screening assessment, we may want to look at the explicitness of the instruction students are receiving. Are they getting enough modeling, demonstrations, enough opportunities to respond with feedback and that sort of thing? We may look at the curriculum. So, what is the curriculum actually covering? In the reading context, we talk about the science of reading a lot. Does the curriculum include all the components of the reading building blocks of reading, right? Phonics and fluency and vocabulary and comprehension and I'm forgetting one, phonemic awareness. Is it addressing all those components or is it leaving some of them out? Um, and similarly with math, we may examine the curriculum and say, are we looking at a spiraled curriculum in math, or is it a more explicit step-by-step strategy approach to teaching math? And so some of those decisions are made at the district level, right? Like what curriculum we're using. And so teachers can advocate or can share the data of the screening assessments and talk about changes that need to be made with those folks. But some things like the explicitness of instruction can be handled at the teacher level, and teachers can make individual choices and decisions around the amount of scaffolding they're providing, the amount of modeling and opportunities to respond and feedback that they're providing students.
Awesome, thank you. So let's say we do the screener, we have all this data. So what is the next step when we do, you talked a little bit about this, but we have a few minutes. So let's talk a little bit more about, so we've identified these students that need this extra intervention, or maybe we have all this data, we did the screener and we've never used this data before. What is the next step and what should we be thinking about?
Yeah, so there's two approaches to what you can do in tier two. One is like a standard protocol approach where everyone in tier two receives the same standard intervention. And you would typically want it to be different than what's happening in tier one because tier one wasn't working for these children. And so, a small group, typically we think of tier two as being small group interventions. So between, 5 to 7 students in a group, and you're providing more opportunities for each of them to respond, more opportunities to hear what the errors they're making and receive feedback from the teacher, and hopefully a more intensive curriculum at that tier two level. And I think that if someone were new to this, that is what I would recommend that they do. There's also a different approach that's not a standardized protocol approach, but it tries to more individually address students' needs. And that's certainly an option, but I think that the individual approach should be reserved for tier three when students are receiving individualized instruction. Um, so yeah, so I think that step two is sort of figuring out like which approach do we want to take, what intervention, what programming, what will that support look like that we're providing at tier two. Um, I saw a question here in the chat. What do we, when we do see over 50% in need of tier two or three instruction, how do we change our tier one instruction when we have pacing guides and standards to address? So, I mean, I think that's a great question. We do have um, to me, the standards aren't as big of a problem. We all have the standards that we need to meet at the end of the year. The pacing guides are a challenge though, because they're telling you like how much time you have to deal with this thing before you move on, right? What I would say is it can be a conversation with district administration if they're willing to have a conversation about some flexibility with those pacing guides. It can also be uh, a I assume in most places that this is happening, it's not a one grade level problem, right? So you're having students in fourth grade, and this is a challenge with the fourth grade teachers, but the third grade teachers in second grade and first grade are probably having the same issue as well. And and so looking at the whole school as a whole and saying like, okay, what do we all have in common? Are we all using the same curriculum? Are we all using the same materials? If that's the case, then maybe it's a conversation, grade level wide, school wide, district wide, to say we need to address this at the curricular level, at some of the sources of these issues, and not just me as one teacher trying to tackle this whole district's systemic problem.
Thank you so much. Um, yes, definitely the vertical collaboration and alignment is critical. It's definitely critical for the success of our students and our teachers. Thank you so much for participating today. Thank you. We hope you will continue to participate in our Lunch and Learns. Our next one will be in October, and we will be advertising that via email and Facebook and X. So please be on the lookout for that. Dr. Romig, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with this group, and we hope you'll join us next time. Take care, everyone.